The emergence of People's Freedom Front is basically a new political front in terms of a force that presents a critical juncture for Uganda's democratic trajectory. So the idea is that if PFF aims to challenge the national resistance movement effectively and basically usher in a meaningful change, it must adopt a highly strategic, adaptable, and visionary approach. And the question that you posed basically invokes some kind of thinking in terms of an analysis. And I will try to decipher this in terms of some intellectual African approach, in terms of thinkers. Let's first of all argue in terms of the PPF or PFF resolutions, in terms of whether or not it actually holds water. The resolution proposed by PFF, working with other forces of change in terms of reviewing strategies, for example, whether liberation or dismantling the tools of repression, are founded by their efficacy in terms of a strategic depth and even practical execution. We need to comprehend in terms of what they call the unity with other forces of change. I would argue in terms of what Kwame Nkrumah warned, unity must first be objective for any liberation movement, for without unity, victory is basically impossible. Now, we also need to contemplate in terms of what they call unified coalition for collective action. PFF must recognize that fragmentation within the opposition has actually historically been a key in terms of weakness. A coalition rooted in terms of shares basically creates a blueprint in terms of mutual trust and even amplifying what they call collective power. Now, as a common agenda versus what they call individual ambitions, the movement must prioritize national agenda over personal political gain to build lasting trust among partners. This requires obviously a memorandum of unity that binds leaders in terms of a shared code of conduct. We also have to comprehend in terms of what they call reviewing strategies for liberation. The idea for strategy must evolve beyond rhetoric into sophisticated dynamic tactics that actually reflect Uganda's unique socio-political terrain. By drawing from, for example, people like Franz Fanon's insight in terms of what they call the wretched of the earth, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill, or even betrayed. Now, innovative political organization in terms of PFF should also adapt decentralized structures that empower local communities to participate in the movement in terms of grassroots cells, focus on local government, social justice, and even economic empowerment that will sustain engagement to build resiliency against suppression. Another aspect is in terms of what they call youth mobilization as a strategic pillar. Uganda's median age is basically median age is about 20. So making a youth formidable constituency becomes of substantive importance in terms of education, in terms of employment, in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of digital platforms and even social media that become vital for outreach, while offline community organization structures create what they call ground level support. Now, the question is, do they have the capacity to succeed? I would answer in the following. The capacity to success depends on the synergy for political will, resource management, and even strategic execution. Now, you could argue in terms of political will and also leadership. I would argue by quoting Nelson Mandela, who rightly articulated that a good head and a good heart are always a formidable combination. So PFF's leadership must be visionary, it must be incorruptible, and capable of inspiring mass participation while demonstrating political and even moral clarity. I would also argue in terms of what they call strategic leadership training. So the movement should actually invest in terms of training infrastructures or future leaders in political strategy in terms of negotiation and also conflict resolution to ensure longevity and adaptability. We could also argue in terms of financial and even resource dependency. We could argue and say self-reliance is critical. I would argue and quote Kwame Nkrumah's emphasis on the dangers of foreign dependency, which reminds us that liberation movements must avoid compromising their integrity. And that is something that is substantive for us to comprehend. We could also argue in terms of what they call innovative resource mobilization. PFF should actually develop crowdsourced funding models that tap into the diaspora and domestic supporters in terms of transparency and accountability in financial and management that will foster trust and sustainability. That becomes super important. We could also argue in terms of legal and institutional engagement. Legal suppression has actually been a primary tool of most leading government, including the NRM, by the way, in terms of borrowing from the strategy of lawfare used by effective governments. For example, in South Africa, or NAC should actually adapt and even co-opt some of those arguments. And we could also argue in terms of building what they call a robust legal defense network to challenge unjust detentions and even human rights violations that are quite eminent in this country as well. So mastering even an electoral system that prevents vote rigging, for example, and even exposed irregularities and hard, with hard evidence becomes a question of importance. Dismantling the tools of oppression becomes a question of importance. Deconstructing patronage and even state capture becomes a question of importance. And therefore, these are things that PFF must address. So PFF must systematically expose and disrupt the regime's patronage networks, transparency campaigns, and even highlight corruption that can mobilize public outrage and even weaken the NRM's legitimacy. Now, in terms of economic advocacy, programs that directly address livelihoods of agriculture, engagement, entrepreneurship should resonate with rural voters who have actually been disillusionized by unfulfilled promises. And we could also argue in terms of digital and even psychological warfare. In a world where, for example, information is power, PFF must dominate the narrative in terms of thorough strategic communication. That becomes super important in terms of the things that they should do. We could also argue in terms of what they call counter propaganda terms. Dedicated units for real-time fact-checking and countering regime propaganda and even neutralizing disinformation. That becomes super important as well. Memes as political tools create the use of humor and satire, a hallmark of, for example, the Arab Spring, that can actually galvanize youth engagement and even spread dissent, valorly. So that is something in terms of importance. Now, if you're to argue as a way forward for Ugandans, because we must contextualize our debate in terms of how relevant is other questions you're asking in terms of Uganda, Ugandan must embrace this moment as an opportunity to reclaim their political destiny. Julius Nyereri's assertion that freedom is not a gift bestowed upon us by other men, but a right that belongs to us by the laws of God and nature captures the very spirit that we are talking about today. And that is important. We need to talk about demanding accountability. Citizens must hold leaders accountable for promises made and demand what they call participatory governance. We need to invest in civic education. That is substantive. Political awareness as a grassroots will actually inculcate or inoculate the public against manipulation and even foster what they call democratic resiliency. We could also argue in terms of what they call sustenance of a culture of resistance. Movements thrive on persistent pressure. That is something you must comprehend. So continuous civic actions from peaceful protests to economic boycotts become substantively essential. So to answer your questions, my friend, I would argue and conclude the following by simply saying that the PFF can succeed if it transitions from mere resolutions to actionable strategies rooted in unity, adaptability, and relentless pursuit of justice. So the road ahead requires intellectual rigor, emotional fortitude, and a steadfast commitment to the ideals of freedom and equality. So Uganda's history obviously has shown that the power concedes nothing without a struggle. And therefore, the PFF must become an embodiment of that very struggle in terms of discipline, strategic, and unyielding in its quest for a new dawn. Thank you, and God bless you.